The bus driver shouted at the man to get off. No reason, no warning, just pure disrespect in front of a full bus. What he didn't know was that the man he humiliated was the most powerful person in the entire city's transport system, his own boss. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you like this kind of story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next one. The morning rush filled the city streets with noise and motion. Buses hissed at stops, horns echoed, and people hurried with tired eyes and coffee in hand. A city bus pulled into the station near a busy crosswalk. Its doors opened with a sigh. Among the crowd waiting, a tall black man stepped forward. His name was Rayhan Malik. His clothes were clean but plain, a gray button-up shirt, black slacks, and a worn leather briefcase hanging from his shoulder. He didn't look like someone important. He didn't move like he had something to prove. He simply tapped his fare card and walked quietly to the middle of the bus. The driver narrowed his eyes the moment Rayhan stepped on board. His name was Tom Ridley, and he had driven this same route for over a decade. There was no greeting, no glance of respect. Only the tight grip on the steering wheel and a hard frown that settled deep in his face. Rayhan took a seat near the window, his hands resting calmly on the briefcase in his lap. A few people glanced at him, then turned away. Some kept watching. A young woman near the front, named Clara, pulled out her phone and began recording, almost like she already knew what was about to happen. The bus rolled forward. Tom kept glancing in the mirror, his eyes locked on Rayhan like he was waiting for trouble. A few blocks passed. Then, without warning, Tom slammed the brakes hard at the next stop. Passengers jerked forward, holding on to metal poles and seatbacks. Tom turned in his seat and pointed at Rayhan. "You! Stand up!" he barked. Rayhan looked up, calm but surprised. "I already paid." Tom's voice got louder. "Did I ask if you paid? I said stand up." The bus went silent. Outside, noise faded beneath the weight of the moment. The other passengers sat frozen. Some looked at Rayhan. Some looked away. Rayhan stood slowly. "Is there a problem?" he asked quietly. "You're loitering," Tom snapped. "Get off the bus." "I paid," Rayhan said again, more clearly this time. "I'm going to work." Tom scoffed. "You people always got a story." At the back of the bus, an older woman named Shabana shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable. A young man in his 20s, Harris, spoke up from the middle row. "He didn't do anything wrong," he said. Tom turned sharply. "You want to get off too?" The engine idled beneath them, but no one moved. Rayhan stayed where he was. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He just looked at Tom with quiet steadiness. "I'd like to stay on. I have a meeting," Rayhan said. Tom grinned in a way that had no kindness. He reached for the radio and pressed the button. "This is Bus 716. Got a fare dodger refusing to leave. Requesting enforcement." Whispers began across the bus. Phones lifted. Cameras clicked on. Clara was already recording everything. Her friend Zara, sitting beside her, whispered, "Why is he doing this? The guy paid." Rayhan didn't flinch. He didn't react. He only adjusted the strap of his briefcase and stood tall in the aisle, quiet, patient, like he was waiting for something. Tom leaned back, satisfied. He thought he had the upper hand. But what he didn't know was that this moment, the one he thought he was winning, was the one that would ruin everything for him. The tension hung in the air like smoke, thick and choking. Rayhan remained standing, his posture straight, his expression calm. He didn't need to speak. His silence said more than any outburst ever could. Around him, the passengers grew restless. Some glanced at their watches, others stared down at their phones, pretending not to notice what was unfolding in front of them. But a few, like Clara, Harris, and Shabana, watched closely. They knew something about this felt wrong. The bus stayed parked at the stop. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the quiet storm building inside. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The screech of tires pulling up beside the bus broke the stillness. A white transit vehicle rolled to a stop. 2 officers stepped out. One was a stocky man with sunglasses, the other a tall woman with a firm jaw and no expression. Their names were Officer Jake and Officer Manal. They stepped onto the bus with slow, deliberate steps. Tom pointed toward Rayhan without hesitation. "That's him," he said. "Didn't pay. Refused to leave. causing trouble. Rayhan didn't react. He simply looked at the officers with steady eyes. Officer Jake looked him over, then glanced at his hands. Rayhan was holding his fare card. It was still active, green light blinking softly. Jake frowned. Sir? Sir, Jake said carefully. Did you tap in? Yes, Rayhan replied, his tone quiet but clear. The machine beeped. I took a seat. Manal leaned over and checked the fare scanner. The log confirmed payment. She looked at Jake. Jake turned back to Tom. He paid. Tom blinked. What? Jake repeated. He paid. It's in the system. Tom's face tightened. Number he didn't. I didn't see it. You weren't looking, Harris said from his seat. He tapped. I saw it. Clara lifted her phone slightly. I recorded it. He didn't do anything wrong. Tom's eyes darted around the bus. The faces watching, the phones recording, the evidence piling up. Jake turned back to Rayhan. Do you have ID, sir? Rayhan gave a small nod and reached into his inner pocket. He pulled out a simple black leather card holder. No rush, no hesitation. He handed it to Jake. Jake opened it, glanced at the photo, and froze. Minal leaned in to look. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. Jake looked back at Rayhan, then at Tom. You really don't know who this is, do you? Jake asked, voice flat. Tom frowned. Number should I? Jake handed the card back to Rayhan with both hands, respectfully. This is Commissioner Rayhan Malik, head of the city's public transport division. The silence that followed was loud. No one moved. No one breathed. Tom's mouth opened, but no words came out. His hands dropped from the wheel. His face turned pale. The passengers looked from Rayhan to Tom, then back to Rayhan. Shabana clutched her purse tighter. Clara's recording didn't stop. And Rayhan? He still hadn't raised his voice, and not once. He simply looked at Tom like a teacher watching a student slowly realize he had failed the test before even reading the questions. Tom's throat moved, but the words stuck somewhere behind his teeth. His eyes darted from Jake to Manal, then to Rayhan, who stood as still as he had from the beginning. There was no anger on Rayhan's face, no pride, no smugness. Just quiet control. That made it worse. Clara lowered her phone slightly, whispering to Zara. He's the commissioner. He runs the whole system. Harris shook his head, muttering under his breath. This is bad. Jake turned to Tom. You called enforcement to remove your own boss from a public bus? His voice wasn't loud, but the weight of it hit like a hammer. Based on what? A guess? Or something else? Tom opened his mouth, trying to recover. I didn't recognize him. He looked like... he didn't say anything. He just stood there. Minal folded her arms. He didn't need to. You judged him before he had the chance. Tom's face flushed with a strange mix of fear and shame. I thought he was just... I didn't know he was... Rayhan finally spoke, his voice calm and slow. You didn't know who I was, so you assumed I was no one. Tom swallowed hard. It was a mistake. A mistake is when you miss a stoplight, Rayhan said softly. What you did was a choice. The silence that followed stretched long and sharp. Jake pulled out a tablet, tapped the screen, and began taking notes. We've had complaints about you before, Minal said without looking up. 3, to be exact. 2 about how you talk to passengers, 1 about an unjustified ejection. Tom turned pale. I didn't know those were formal. They are now, Jake said, especially after today. Tom took a step forward, hands raised slightly. Look, I didn't mean any harm. I just didn't recognize him, and... Rayhan interrupted him gently. You didn't need to recognize me. You just needed to treat me like a person. The words landed heavier than any shouting ever could. Clara's phone stayed fixed on Tom's face, capturing every second of his unraveling. Around the bus, passengers were no longer silent. Their expressions had changed. Respect for Rayhan, disgust for Tom. Jake tapped the screen again. Until further notice, you are being placed on administrative leave pending review. Turn off the engine, step outside, and wait in the transit vehicle. Tom's shoulders sagged. He turned toward the door but paused. He looked at Rayhan as if searching for mercy. Rayhan didn't speak. He didn't nod. He just watched. Tom stepped off the bus. No applause followed, no cheers. Just quiet, steady justice settling into place. The doors closed behind Tom with a soft hiss, but the sound carried the weight of finality. The bus remained still, the engine humming low. No one spoke right away. All eyes slowly turned to Rayhan, who now stood alone near the front. His shoulders remained relaxed, his face unreadable. He looked out the window for a moment, as if watching something far beyond the city streets. Jake cleared his throat. "Sir, is there anything else you'd like us to do?" Rayhan shook his head gently. I think you've done enough for now." Meenal gave a respectful nod. "If you need a formal report, let us know. We'll file it today." Rayhan gave a polite smile. "Thank you, officer." Jake and Meenal stepped off the bus, leaving behind a space that suddenly felt brighter, lighter. The passengers sat in silence, unsure whether to speak, move, or stay still. It was Harris who finally broke the tension. "That was, something," he said, mostly to himself. Rayhan glanced over at him, then at the others. "I appreciate those who spoke up, and those who didn't." He paused, choosing his words. "I hope next time, you will." Shabana lowered her eyes, embarrassed. Clara looked down at her phone and stopped recording. She seemed more affected now, not just recording for show, but truly realizing what she had witnessed. Rayhan didn't lecture. He didn't scold. He simply walked back to his seat, sat down calmly, and placed the briefcase on his lap once again. Like nothing had happened, like it was just another morning. A new driver boarded the bus a few minutes later. A younger man named Imran, quiet and respectful. He greeted everyone with a nod, his eyes widening slightly when he noticed Rayhan. But he said nothing and took his seat behind the wheel. As the bus pulled back into traffic, a strange quietness remained. Not uncomfortable, but reflective. People sat up straighter. Some put their phones away. Others just stared out the window. And Rayhan? He sat still, his gaze steady on the city passing by, knowing the lesson had already been delivered. Not by force, not by rank, but by making sure the truth stood tall where disrespect once tried to take its place. The bus rolled forward, but the weight of what had just happened lingered like a scent no one could shake. Though no one spoke, the silence now carried respect instead of tension. Imran, the new driver, checked the mirror now and then, not out of suspicion, but as if reminding himself that someone important was seated among the passengers. Not because of the title, but because of how the man carried himself through insult, humiliation, and injustice without ever losing his composure. Rayhan remained still in his seat. His hands rested lightly on his briefcase. His gaze drifted out the window, watching the blur of concrete and glass pass by. The city was loud and fast, always moving, always talking. But the moment on that bus had created a pause, a breath in the middle of noise, a reminder that respect should never depend on recognition. Behind him, conversation slowly picked up. Harris leaned toward Clara and Zara. "Can you believe that guy tried to throw him out? Like he owned the bus?" Clara shook her head. "He didn't even care if he was wrong. He just assumed." "I've seen it before," Zara said quietly. "Not this bad, but people decide who you are before you even speak." In the row behind them, Shabana clutched her bag a little tighter. She hadn't spoken up. She had wanted to. The shame settled deeper now. She looked at Rayhan's calm figure and whispered, "He gave that man so many chances to stop." The conversation moved through the bus like a current, soft, thoughtful, full of people trying to understand what they had seen. Not just the embarrassment of a bus driver caught mistreating someone in authority, but the deeper truth. If Rayhan had not been the commissioner, if he had just been another worker, another face in the crowd, the outcome could have been very different. Near the front, a boy around 10 years old sat beside his mother, wide-eyed. "Mama," he whispered, "he's like a superhero." His mother smiled faintly, brushing his hair. "He's a man who knows his worth," she replied. "That's rarer than a superhero." The bus made its stops as usual, passengers getting on and off, but each person who stepped on seemed to pause just a moment longer than usual, as if sensing something had shifted inside that space. Imran drove with quiet focus, but even he kept stealing glances in the mirror. He didn't know Rayhan personally, but the story was already forming in his head, and he knew he'd remember this day for a long time. At the next major stop, a group of passengers boarded, workers in uniforms, a couple of students, and a man in a business suit who looked impatient. As the suit-wearing man looked around for a seat, he barely glanced at Rayhan, who remained seated by the window. There was nothing flashy about him. No badge, no title displayed, just a man on a bus. The new passenger frowned slightly, then looked toward Imran. "Why's the bus late?" he demanded. Imran didn't answer immediately. He looked back in the mirror, met Rayhan's gaze briefly, then returned his eyes to the road. "There was an issue," Imran said calmly, "but it's been handled." The man muttered something under his breath and sat down, not knowing that the reason the bus was late was because the person sitting a few feet from him had just dismantled a whole pattern of quiet discrimination with nothing but his presence and restraint. And still, Rayhan said nothing. He simply sat as he had before, not needing recognition, not looking for attention, letting the weight of his silence say more than any title ever could. As the bus moved deeper into the city, Rayhan's silence continued to echo louder than any conversation inside. He sat still, almost motionless, but his presence had changed everything around him. The morning rush, once full of irritation and hurry, now carried an unspoken awareness. People shifted in their seats differently. They looked at each other longer. Some reflected on what they had done, or not done, when Tom had tried to force him off. No one said it aloud, but almost everyone had the same thought. If he hadn't been the commissioner, would anyone have cared? Imran continued driving, his hand steady on the wheel, though he was clearly more careful now. He stopped gently at each sign, glanced more often in the rearview mirror, and offered soft greetings to new passengers. He was younger, maybe in his early 30s, and though he had only been on the job for a few years, he understood quickly that today was not just another shift. Rayhan remained seated, watching the city roll past through the smudged window. His thoughts were unreadable, hidden behind a calm expression. He wasn't thinking about revenge or punishment. His job was too familiar with such stories. He had sat in meetings where policies were debated endlessly, but faces like Tom's were rarely named. The quiet kind of abuse, the kind that didn't scream or strike, but judged and discarded, was harder to prove and easier to ignore. That's why today mattered. A woman 2 rows ahead finally turned around. Her name was Yasmin, and she had watched the whole thing from the beginning. She had stayed quiet during the incident, but something about the way Rayhan had handled it kept stirring her chest. She looked at him now, unsure how to begin. "Sir?" she said softly. Rayhan looked up, his expression still composed. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry I didn't speak up earlier," she said, her voice low but clear. "I knew it wasn't right. I froze." Rayhan nodded gently, his voice calm. "Fear is normal. Silence becomes a problem only when it becomes a habit." Yasmin lowered her head, her cheeks warming. His reply hadn't been meant to hurt, but it struck her with more honesty than she expected. "Thank you," she said, "for handling it the way you did." He gave a small, understanding smile. Sometimes silence does more damage than noise. Behind her, Harris leaned into the conversation. "Most people would have shouted or punched him. You just waited." Rayhan looked at Harris. "Anger is easy. Control takes more strength." Clara, still holding her phone in her lap, nodded. "You changed the whole mood without saying more than 10 sentences. Zara added. "He didn't even know who you were. That's the worst part." Rayhan's eyes shifted back to the window. "It's not the worst part," he said quietly. "The worst part is how easily he thought he could get away with it." The words settled over everyone like a slow-moving shadow. Outside, the city buzzed with life. Horns, footsteps, early lunch crowds beginning to gather. But inside the bus, the atmosphere remained still. People weren't just watching anymore. They were listening. At the next stop, a tall man in a navy coat stepped onto the bus. He looked around, his eyes landing briefly on Rayhan and then back toward Imran. "Is this the same bus from the incident this morning?" he asked loudly, holding up an ID badge clipped to his coat. Imran hesitated. "Yes, why?" "I'm with city administration. The commissioner is scheduled for a 10 a.m. inspection meeting. He didn't show up, so they sent me to check in." The man's voice was respectful, but confused. We were told something happened on the route. Harris glanced at Clara. Zara leaned forward slightly. The passengers collectively turned toward Rayhan again. The man in the navy coat looked around until his eyes landed directly on him. He blinked, startled. "Sir?" Rayhan gave a short nod. "Meeting's been delayed." The man straightened, clearly rattled. "Should I arrange a car? They'll hold the room." Rayhan waved a hand gently. "No need. I'll get there on time." "But after what happened?" Rayhan met his eyes and the man stopped speaking mid-sentence. "I don't want a headline. I want a solution," Rayhan said simply. The man nodded, not questioning him again. The passengers stared, some wide-eyed, others almost ashamed by how they had underestimated him earlier. Not just because of his title, but because someone so quiet had turned a moment of insult into a reminder of dignity, power, and truth. The man in the navy coat stepped back off the bus without another word. Imran pulled away from the stop and continued driving, and Rayhan leaned back in his seat, his fingers resting once again on his old leather briefcase, the weight of the morning no longer on his shoulders, but on every person who had watched and realized something inside them needed to change. The bus moved steadily through the heart of the city. Traffic thickened, the sidewalks grew more crowded, and yet inside everything felt quieter. Rayhan hadn't said a word since the last stop, but his presence still filled the space. People weren't looking at their phones anymore. They weren't zoning out like before. They were thinking, processing. Some replayed the morning in their minds, the insults, the silence, the sudden shift in power, and questioned where they stood during it. Toward the back, an older man named Naveed, dressed in a janitor's uniform, cleared his throat and spoke loud enough for the front to hear. "I've been riding these buses for 20 years, seen things like this plenty. This one just got caught." A few people turned to him. Harris nodded slowly. "You're right. It's always been happening, just not to someone with a title." Clara added, "The scary part is how casual it was, like it was normal for the driver to act like that." Rayan finally looked up again. His eyes were tired but focused. "That's because it is normal. It shouldn't be, but it is." Naveed leaned forward. "They don't see people like us. They see noise. Something in the way. Doesn't matter if you're quiet, polite, or early to work. They only see what they want to." Zara, soft-spoken until now, added, "If someone like you," she glanced at Rayhan, "can be treated like that, what chance do the rest of us have?" Rayhan didn't answer immediately. His silence wasn't avoidance. He was choosing his words carefully. "It's not about what chance we have," he finally said. "It's about what we allow to continue." They didn't expect anyone to question him, not even me, because for too long, people like Tom have believed the silence around them is approval. And most of the time, they're right. That truth stung. Several passengers lowered their eyes. Even those who had supported him during the confrontation now felt the discomfort of their own past silences. The times they looked away, the moments they convinced themselves it wasn't their business. A young student sitting near the front named Salman turned around. He had earbuds in his lap and books stacked on his knees. "You didn't yell. You didn't even raise your voice. You let him do everything, and still, he lost." Rayhan looked at the boy. "He lost the moment he thought authority was the same as power." Imran, up front, quietly nodded. He hadn't said a word during the last few stops, but he had listened to every word. Driving the same streets, wearing the same uniform as Tom had, he knew what kind of culture lived in that space. He had seen drivers joke about passengers, judge people before they even spoke, laugh at complaints that never reached the office. He hadn't liked it, but he hadn't spoken either, until today. The bus stopped again. More passengers boarded. One of them, a middle-aged woman named Farzana, stepped on and looked around for a seat. Her eyes passed over Rayhan without recognition. She turned to Imran. "Why is the bus so behind?" "I waited 15 minutes. Before Imran could answer, another passenger, an older man named Basit, called out from his seat. Because the old driver tried to throw someone off for no reason, he didn't know who he was messing with. Farzana frowned. "What do you mean?" "He tried to kick out the commissioner of public transport," Clara said, her tone a mix of awe and anger. Farzana's eyes widened. She turned toward Rayhan slowly. now truly looking at him. "You're that commissioner?" Rayhan gave a small nod. She stared for a long moment, then said softly, "And you're still riding the same bus like the rest of us?" Rayhan shrugged. "I'm not above the people I serve." A hush fell again. That one sentence traveled from the front to the back of the bus, bouncing off the walls of people's minds, settling heavy in their chests. It wasn't just humility, it was a challenge. A reminder of what leadership was supposed to look like. Farzana finally took her seat, her eyes still on him. "Well," she said under her breath, "maybe the city's not broken after all." The ride continued. The wheels hummed against the pavement. Buildings rose and passed like silent witnesses to the quiet transformation happening inside that crowded vehicle. And though the bus was now full, it carried more than just people. It carried the memory of justice done right, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, this one moment might ripple far beyond the morning. The next few stops passed slowly, but no one seemed to mind. What had started as a routine commute had turned into something no one could have predicted. Rayhan sat in the same position, his back straight, hands resting on his briefcase. He wasn't trying to stand out, but no one could ignore him now. He had become the center of every thought on that bus. Not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't need to say. Each time new passengers stepped on, a quiet ripple moved through the seated crowd. Eyes flicked toward Rayhan, then toward the driver's seat where Imran sat. Not because anything was wrong now, but because people sensed they had just missed something important. Imran didn't explain, but his body language was sharper than before. More alert, more aware of what this seat meant. He greeted each person with respect, his voice steady and clear. The contrast between him and Tom was impossible to miss. A man in his early 40s boarded next. His name was Najib. He wore a gray suit, carried a tablet under his arm, and had the kind of expression that said he was used to being in charge. He stepped onto the bus, glanced at the crowd, and immediately spotted Rayhan. His brows lifted slightly. He didn't say anything, but kept looking. Longer than necessary. Rayhan noticed but didn't acknowledge him. Najib slowly made his way to the nearest empty seat and sat across the aisle. After a moment, he leaned in slightly. "I know who you are," he said, not bothering to whisper. Rayhan turned to him briefly, saying nothing. Najib smiled faintly, almost smug. "I've seen you on panels. I was at the budget meeting last year. You wore a navy suit, red tie." Rayhan nodded once. "That sounds right. I didn't expect to see you here, riding with regular passengers?" Rayhan turned his gaze back to the window. "Why not?" Najib chuckled. "I don't know. I guess I assumed someone in your position would use a city car, or at least sit in a private office all day." "That's part of the problem," Rayhan replied quietly. Najib tilted his head. "Problem? When leadership forgets what the people experience, they stop leading. They just start managing." For a few seconds, Najib didn't respond. He sat back, his smile fading. The words had landed harder than he expected. Around them, a few passengers listened in, pretending not to, but catching every word. Haris turned slightly in his seat. Yasmin paused mid-scroll on her phone. Shabana, who had been quiet for a while, looked up again. Rayhan continued, his tone calm, as if he were just thinking aloud. "We have policies that sound great in meetings. We design systems with rules and routes and penalties, but we never ride the bus. We never wait at the stop at 6 a.m. in the rain. We don't know which driver humiliates a passenger, which seatbelt is broken, which route skips stops when it's running late. We pretend we know, but we don't, because we're too far away from the people who live with the decisions we make." Najib didn't answer. He looked out the window now, a bit quieter than before. Rayhan didn't need to push further. He hadn't spoken to win an argument. He had spoken a truth. One that couldn't be brushed off with a smile or smoothed over with polite conversation. Then from the front of the bus, Imran's voice called back, loud enough for all to hear. "Approaching Municipal Tower. Final stop." The moment hung in the air. Everyone knew what was waiting at that stop. Not just a building, not just a meeting, but the rest of this story. The next chapter, where what happened on this bus wouldn't stay just a memory among a few passengers. It would become a decision in a boardroom, a review in a transit department, a headline in tomorrow's news. Rayhan reached down, slowly unzipping the flap of his briefcase. Inside were two thin folders. He pulled one out, checked it, and placed it back. Then he closed the bag and stood. As he moved toward the front, the aisle cleared without anyone being asked. Passengers leaned aside. Some nodded. Some avoided his gaze, still thinking. And a few looked at him with something like admiration. Not because he was powerful, but because he had used that power without needing to show it. He stopped just behind Imran, who turned slightly in his seat. Rayhan placed a hand gently on the metal bar near the door. "Good work today." Imran's mouth parted slightly. "I didn't do much." "You stayed professional," Rayhan said. "That's more than some people manage in years." Imran nodded, a quiet respect passing between them. Rayhan looked out at the building approaching through the glass. Tall, gray, and full of decisions. He didn't move yet. Not because he was waiting, but because the moment hadn't finished teaching its lesson. The bus pulled to a smooth stop in front of the municipal tower, a towering structure of glass and stone, where meetings were held, budgets decided, and citywide policies approved or denied. But today, for everyone who had shared that ride, the real decisions had already started back on the road. Inside the bus, a hush had settled once again, the kind of silence that meant something important was ending, or beginning. Rayhan remained by the front doors, his hand still lightly resting on the metal pole. The building loomed ahead, familiar to him, but it didn't feel like a place of power anymore. Not compared to the cramped rows of seats behind him. Not compared to the quiet stares of everyday people who had seen, for the first time in a long time, that someone from above wasn't above them at all. Imran looked up from his seat. "Sir, do you want me to wait here until you're done? I can keep the route paused." Rayhan turned to him. "Numbers stick to the route. The city depends on things running on time. Even today." Imran nodded, though the respect in his eyes made it clear he would have waited for hours if asked. As Rayhan prepared to step down, Clara stood up from her seat, holding her phone at her side. "Commissioner," she said softly. He turned to her, waiting. "I recorded everything. I was going to post it online. I still might. But I wanted to ask first, not because I think you need protection, but because I know what the internet can do." Rayhan studied her for a moment. "If you post it, post the whole thing," he said. "Don't cut the quiet parts. Don't leave out the silence. That's where people need to look hardest." Clara nodded slowly, understanding more than just the words. A few rows back, Yasmin stood as well. "Do you really think anything will change?" she asked. Her voice wasn't doubting. It was tired, honest. Because men like Tom, they don't just disappear. They get moved, reassigned, protected. Rayhan's eyes met hers with a steadiness that had nothing to do with titles or offices. "Not if we stop allowing it," he said. "Not if people like you remember what happened here and refuse to forget." Yasmin held his gaze for a long moment, then sat back down. Rayhan stepped off the bus. The doors closed behind him with a soft hiss, and the bus slowly pulled away from the curb. Through the rear window, several passengers continued to watch him. The quiet man in plain clothes standing alone at the base of the building, where policy met reality. Inside the tower, the air was cooler. The marble floors polished. Security guards nodded as he passed, though even they looked at him with a new level of awareness after the morning's incident. Word traveled fast, especially when it came from the streets instead of the press room. Rayhan made his way to the elevator and pressed the button for the 10th floor. The floor where public hearings were held, where department heads defended budgets and fielded complaints from city council members who didn't ride the bus they funded. As the elevator climbed, he adjusted his shirt cuffs slowly, mind still on the faces inside that vehicle. They weren't just witnesses. They were the public, the voters, the ignored voices, the ones who showed up early to work but stayed quiet when insulted, the ones who believed nothing would ever change because too many people above them didn't know what it meant to be below. The elevator doors opened. Outside the meeting room, his assistant, Kaleem, stood waiting with a tablet and a concerned expression. "Sir," he said quickly, stepping in, "there's a crowd inside, press 2. Apparently someone leaked the video already. It's spreading fast." Rayhan didn't react. Good. Kaleem hesitated. Are you sure? Some officials, they're not happy. They say it makes the department look unstable. Rayhan took the tablet from his hands, scrolling briefly through the news headlines. Commissioner humiliated on city bus. Transit driver suspended after confrontation. Ontetui. Passengers, record city officials, mistreatment. He handed the tablet back. If accountability makes us look unstable, then maybe we were never steady to begin with. Kaleem fell silent. The double doors to the hearing room opened, and the low buzz of conversation stopped as Rayhan entered. Every chair was filled. Every camera pointed toward him. Some council members looked uneasy, others angry. A few had the decency to look ashamed. Rayhan walked to the front of the room, placed his briefcase gently on the table, and slowly looked across the room of decision-makers. He wasn't just about to speak about the budget or route extensions or fare increases. Today, he was going to talk about power and who really deserved to hold it. Rayhan stood in front of the long wooden table, the city seal engraved into the backdrop behind him. He didn't take a seat. Instead, he remained standing as he opened his briefcase and carefully placed a few papers on the desk in front of him. He knew how this room worked. The polished speeches, the polite nods, the silent dismissals behind practiced smiles. But today, the silence in the room wasn't from formality. It was from discomfort, from fear, and from the awareness that the man now standing before them had not just experienced the broken system, he had lived it that very morning, with dozens of witnesses and digital proof now spreading across the city faster than any carefully written press release could catch. A voice broke the silence. It belonged to Councilman Tariq, an older man with thick glasses and the habit of interrupting whenever things got uncomfortable. Commissioner, I think we can all agree that what happened this morning was unfortunate, but we hope it won't distract from today's agenda. Rayhan's eyes didn't leave him. It is today's agenda. Tariq cleared his throat. Of course, but... No but, Rayhan said, still calm. I'm not here to explain why the bus was 3 minutes late. I'm here to explain why a man with 27 citizen complaints was still behind the wheel of a city vehicle. I'm here to explain why, even after multiple reports, we didn't act. Why our review system is slow, buried under paperwork. Why the people who are supposed to feel safe on public transit are treated like threats, while the real threat wears the uniform. The room shifted. Some council members leaned back in their chairs. Others avoided his gaze. Let's not call it an unfortunate incident, Rayhan continued. Let's call it what it was. Abuse of authority, discrimination, a public servant humiliating a citizen without cause. The only difference today was that the man he targeted wasn't powerless. And that shouldn't be the reason this room is listening. Councilwoman Farhat, who had remained silent, finally leaned forward. Commissioner, what do you recommend? Rayhan paused for a moment. Then he reached into his folder and pulled out a printed document. Immediate suspension and review of all drivers with unresolved complaints in the last 12 months. Mandatory body cams on all transit enforcement. Passenger rights displayed in every vehicle, in 3 languages, and a monthly anonymous review system for both drivers and enforcement officers, accessible to every commuter. There were murmurs. Councilman Tariq frowned. Body cams? Do you have any idea how much that will cost? Rayhan looked directly at him. Do you have any idea how much it's costing us not to? The question didn't need an answer. Everyone in the room knew what had happened this morning was not the first time. It was just the first time the wrong person had been targeted. Wrong for the driver, right for justice. He walked around the table slowly, his footsteps echoing on the tile. This department doesn't need more money. It needs more honesty, more presence. Leaders who stop hiding behind desks and actually step onto the buses, sit in the seats, and look the people we serve in the eye. He stopped and turned to face them all. If we wait for the next video to go viral before we act, we're not leading, we're reacting. And the people are already ahead of us. Silence fell again, heavier now, not awkward, but shaken. Rayhan could see it in their faces, the ones who had always dismissed reports like the one from this morning, the ones who had said the words, "We'll look into it," and never did. He wasn't there to play politics. He wasn't there to protect the department. He was there to burn down the silence that had protected people like Tom Ridley for years. Councilwoman Farhat nodded slowly. I support your recommendations. All of them. A few others raised their hands in agreement. Rayhan didn't smile. He didn't need to. This wasn't a victory. It was only a step. He gathered his papers, slid them back into his briefcase, and looked around the room one last time. I'm heading back to the office now, he said quietly. But tomorrow morning I'll be on bus 719. Same route, same time, and I expect to be treated like every other rider, with dignity, nothing more, nothing less. Without waiting for applause or permission, he turned and walked out. Behind him the room stayed quiet, not from confusion, but from something far more powerful. Accountability, at last. Rayhan stepped out of the council chamber into the hallway, where the polished floor reflected the cold fluorescence above. His footsteps were steady, but his mind was already back on the bus. Not the council room, not the folded papers now sitting quietly in his briefcase. That ride had said more than 100 reports ever could. What happened there wasn't just an incident. It was evidence. Not the kind written in ink, but the kind etched into the eyes of every person who had watched it happen and said, this is normal. He passed a row of staff offices. Some people nodded respectfully as he walked by. Others quickly shifted their eyes or pretended to check their phones. Rayhan knew those reactions well. Respect mixed with discomfort. The look people give when truth walks past them and doesn't need to shout. He let them be. Not everyone was ready, but soon they would have no choice. At the end of the hall, Kaleem caught up with him again, tablet in hand, sweat beading slightly on his forehead. Sir, 3 press outlets are requesting statements. Channel 9 wants an interview by noon. They've already pulled the video footage from the passengers' posts. It's going viral, Twitter, Facebook, everywhere. You're trending right now. Rayhan stopped at the elevator, pressed the button, and looked at Kaleem. Let the video speak. I don't want to make this about me. But sir, the media… Kaleem, Rayhan said quietly, if I speak now, it becomes about one man with a title who got mistreated. I want it to stay about every man who didn't have one and was ignored. Let it grow without me. Kaleem hesitated, then nodded, silently absorbing another lesson. The elevator opened, and Rayhan stepped inside, alone. As the doors closed, he exhaled, not in exhaustion, but in preparation. The ride down was short, but it gave him a moment, a small pocket of quiet in a day full of noise and hidden judgment. He wasn't tired. He was just aware of what still had to be done. The doors opened to the lobby, where a few people were waiting. A security guard, a janitor, 2 office assistants. All of them turned when they saw him. Some with surprise, some with quiet nods of respect. None of them reached for their phones. They didn't need proof. They had already seen enough in their own lives. As Rayhan stepped out of the building, the street was alive with movement. Buses roaring down their lanes, motorbikes weaving through traffic, food carts setting up along the sidewalks. He blended into it like everyone else. No security, no press statement, no flashing lights. Just a man with a briefcase crossing the street on green, heading toward the transit department building a few blocks down. Inside his office, reports were waiting, emails piling up, internal investigations beginning. There would be questions, demands, defenses, people who would say he was making too much of it, others who would say he hadn't done enough. But Rayhan wasn't concerned with them. He had heard those voices before. What mattered now were the people whose voices had never been heard, the ones still riding the buses, still standing at the back, still wondering whether their rights were real or just written down on paper that no one read. He walked into the transit department quietly, nodding at the receptionist. She looked up, startled for a moment, then smiled. Commissioner, she said, I saw the video. It's everywhere. Rayhan smiled back faintly. Then maybe people are finally looking in the right direction. She lowered her voice. Some of the staff are nervous. A few drivers already called in, asking if there's going to be mass reviews. There will be, Rayhan said simply. He made his way to his office, the hallway echoing with each footstep. When he opened the door, he didn't sit down right away. He walked to the window, looking out at the city, the buses moving like veins across the streets, the people boarding and stepping off like blood through the heart of the city. He didn't need a press conference. He didn't need applause. What he needed was movement, real change. Because this wasn't about what happened to him. It was about what had been happening to everyone else for far too long. When no one was recording, when no commissioner was present, and when silence filled the bus even louder than the engine. He turned back to his desk and picked up a file. It was the first on his new list, Driver Review, Ridley, Thomas. Below that, a second tab, Policy Rewrite, Passenger Protection Framework. And beneath it all, a note scribbled in pencil. Not typed, not formal. Just something he had written after stepping off the bus. Power isn't what you hold. It's what you choose not to use. He underlined it once. Then he got to work. The day unfolded with relentless urgency. One by one, emails poured in. Most from city officials, some supportive, others cautiously critical, and a few openly defensive. They used words like optics, public image, and department morale. But Rayhan ignored all of it. He wasn't interested in optics. He had seen reality too closely that morning to care about appearances. A few hours into the afternoon, his office phone rang. Kaleem's voice came through, quiet but tense. "Sir, Thomas Ridley's union representative is here. He's demanding a meeting." Rayhan didn't hesitate. "Send them in." A moment later, the door opened, and a tall man in a dark brown suit entered, followed by a shorter, older man with heavy shoulders and tired eyes. The taller one spoke first. "Commissioner Malik, I'm Assad Din from the Transit Workers Union. This is Mr. Ridley." Rayhan gestured to the chairs across from his desk, but remained standing. Ridley sat slowly, avoiding eye contact, while Assad leaned forward, already in full defense mode. "Commissioner, I want to make it clear that Thomas has had a spotless record for most of his career. Yes, there were a few complaints, but nothing serious enough to warrant suspension without due process. He's a senior driver, and we believe he deserves a fair hearing." Rayhan raised an eyebrow, then walked slowly to his desk and opened a folder. "Do you know how many complaints a few really means in this case, Mr. Din?" Assad hesitated. "I believe 3 were formally documented." Rayhan turned the folder toward them. 16 in total, 3 formal, 13 informal, all within the last 4 years. 4 complaints used the words hostile or aggressive. 2 mentioned racial slurs. 1 included a passenger recording, but it was lost in the system because it didn't go viral. Assad stiffened. "Commissioner, with all due respect, 1 video doesn't erase 2 decades of—" "No, it doesn't," Rayhan interrupted, voice calm but firm. "But what it does erase is the illusion that complaints don't matter if they come from people who don't shout loud enough." Ridley shifted in his seat, eyes still cast downward. He hadn't said a word yet. Rayhan's gaze finally landed on him. "Tom," he said quietly, "I want to hear you. Speak." Ridley looked up, startled by the invitation. He cleared his throat. I made a mistake." Rayhan's tone didn't change. "You made a choice. Don't soften it." Ridley's face tightened. "I didn't know who you were. And that's the only reason you're sitting in this office right now instead of walking out in handcuffs," Rayhan said sharply. "If I'd been a delivery worker, a janitor, or a student, you would have thrown me off that bus without a second thought. You would have humiliated me and driven off, and no one would have stopped you." Ridley swallowed hard. "I didn't mean—" "But you did mean it," Rayhan cut in, voice low. "You meant every word, every look. You just didn't expect to get caught." Assad raised a hand, trying to regain control of the room. "Commissioner, we can negotiate terms of review. Maybe a short-term leave, diversity training." Rayhan shut the folder. "He's suspended, effective immediately. The review board will determine if his license should be permanently revoked. If it were up to me, he wouldn't wear that uniform again." Assad opened his mouth, but Rayhan leaned forward slightly. "This isn't punishment. This is correction. Not just for him, but for every driver watching this unfold. If we don't send the message now, we tell the whole system that what he did is just another bad day at work." Assad sat back, lips pressed tightly. He didn't agree, but he knew the weight of the moment, the eyes on this case, the truth of the video. Ridley finally spoke again, voice almost a whisper. "I didn't think anyone would believe them. The ones who complained before. I thought no one cared. Rayhan looked at him, and this time there was no sharpness in his face, only something more dangerous: clarity. That's because for years no one did. Ridley lowered his head again, and Rayhan said nothing more. There was nothing else to say. Asid helped Ridley up, and they left the office together, the door closing softly behind them. Kaleem walked in a minute later. "More media requests," he said. "And sir, the mayor's office wants a meeting. They've seen the video too." Rayhan exhaled slowly. "Schedule it." As Kaleem turned to leave, Rayhan glanced at the window again. The streets below bustled with life, but all he could see were buses. Hundreds of them. Thousands of riders. Millions of silent moments. Some full of kindness, many not. He thought of the drivers who smiled, who helped the elderly, who waited patiently for the last person to reach the door. He also thought of the ones like Ridley, and he thought of what it would take to make sure the next complaint was not ignored, buried, or dismissed, but believed. Because the real change was never going to come from a viral video. It had to come from a city that finally started listening when no one was filming. By early evening, the sunlight had shifted across the city, painting long shadows across the streets, stretching across sidewalks like reminders of the day that had passed. The video from the morning had now reached nearly every corner of the city's social channels. Local news anchors replayed the footage in segments, carefully dissecting each moment. The confrontation, the silence, the reveal, and most of all, Rayhan's restraint. But inside the Transport Commission building, the noise didn't reach Rayhan, not in the way it reached the public. For him, the noise had always been there, just quieter, duller, buried under decades of routine, paperwork, and the slow erosion of accountability. Today hadn't created a problem, it had only dragged it into the light. Rayhan remained in his office, the only light now coming from the desk lamp and the distant orange hue of the city outside. In front of him were 3 piles of files. The first was a stack labeled Driver Complaints, Unresolved. The second was Passenger Reports, No Action Taken. The third, thinner, was titled Pending Investigations. That last stack had remained the smallest for years, until now. He reached for the first file on the top of the unresolved complaints pile. It belonged to a woman named Feroza. Her report, written in small, careful handwriting, described a driver who had told her to sit in the back even when seats were available up front. No shouting, no violence, just quiet. Calculated humiliation, the kind that slips through cracks and into the shadows of bureaucracy. Rayhan stared at the report. The date read 10 months ago. The note from the review team said, no action taken, no video evidence. He closed the folder, jaw tightening. A soft knock came at the door. It opened gently before he could answer. It was Kaleem again, holding a small file in his hand. "Sorry to interrupt, sir," he said. "This one just came in today. I thought you'd want to see it." Rayhan reached for it. Inside was a handwritten note. A new complaint. But this one wasn't about mistreatment. It was from Clara. He began to read. Commissioner Malik didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask for help. He didn't need to. Because just by standing still, he made everyone around him realize what they were willing to tolerate and what they weren't. "I've ridden the bus for 5 years. I've seen a dozen versions of what happened today, but it never changed, until now. Please don't let this become another forgotten story. Please let it matter." Below her note, Kaleem had added a yellow sticky tab, suggested, use as part of new training materials. Rayhan sat back slowly, folding the letter, setting it beside his laptop. Not because it was part of policy, but because it was proof. Proof that people were watching, and more importantly, waking up. He turned his attention to the screen. He opened a blank document titled Transit Code Revision, Working Draft. His fingers hovered over the keys, not to write a press release, not to impress council members, but to begin the real work, the kind that wouldn't make headlines but would change the ground beneath people's feet. He typed the first line, "Every rider deserves respect before recognition." He paused, then continued, "Every driver must be held accountable, not for mistakes, but for repeated choices that endanger public dignity." Outside, the city kept moving. Cars, buses, bikes, all following paths mapped out years ago. But inside that quiet office, something was finally shifting. Rehan wasn't chasing justice through rules anymore. He was rewriting the foundation those rules stood on. Kaleem sat silently in the chair opposite him, unsure whether to speak or leave. Rehan glanced up. "Kaleem," he said, "starting next week, I want every department head to ride public transit for 2 hours a day. No cars, no excuses." Kaleem's eyebrows rose. "All of them. All of them," Rehan said. "They'll report what they see, what they hear, what people are afraid to say, and they'll keep doing it until they learn what this job actually means." Kaleem nodded slowly, half impressed, half stunned. "I'll make the list." Rehan turned back to the screen. "Until media relations, I won't be doing interviews." Kaleem blinked. "You're sure?" "They're asking for comment." "They already got it," Rehan said quietly. "It happened this morning, on that bus. I'm not here to be quoted. I'm here to change what doesn't need quotes anymore." As Kaleem stood to leave, Rehan's fingers began typing again. Not in the voice of a leader trying to protect a title, but in the voice of someone who had once been told to sit down and had decided never to stay seated again. The following morning arrived quietly. No alarms, no announcements. Just the same tired sunrise falling across the rooftops of the city, turning windows gold and pavement warm. The headlines had exploded overnight. Commissioner humiliated, then strikes back with grace. Powerful without raising a voice. City bus ride that changed transit policy. Social feeds were flooded with reactions, praise, debates, and commentary. But Rehan Malik ignored it all. He woke at his usual time, washed, dressed in the same modest clothes he had worn the day before. No suit, no badge, no press escort. Just a plain gray shirt, black slacks, and his old briefcase. He didn't check the news. He didn't glance at trending tags. Instead, he packed the file labeled Feroza, unresolved complaint, placed it into his briefcase with care, and stepped out of his apartment with one purpose: to ride bus 719 again. At the corner stop, the city was as it always was: fast, loud, indifferent. A young man argued over the phone. A teenage girl adjusted her backpack. An old man leaned against a wall, staring at the ground. Rehan stood among them quietly. No one recognized him. He liked it that way. A few minutes later, the bus hissed to a halt. Doors opened. It was a different driver today, a middle-aged woman named Parveen. She greeted each rider with a small nod, checking cards and waving them through. Rehan tapped his card, the beep confirming payment. Parveen looked at him briefly, then nodded with no hint of recognition. Just a human acknowledging another. The bus was less crowded today. Rehan took a seat near the back and rested his briefcase on his knees. He noticed the woman across from him, scrolling on her phone. She paused, then looked up. Her eyes narrowed as she realized who he was, but she said nothing, only offered a soft, respectful nod. Rehan returned it, just slightly, and looked away. As the ride continued, passengers came and went. Some talked quietly. Others stared out the window, lost in thought. At one stop, a group of schoolboys got on, loud, energetic, unaware of anything beyond their own world. At another, a man stepped on with a limp and 2 shopping bags. Rehan watched Parveen rise gently from her seat and help the man step up safely. Her voice was calm. "Take your time. No rush." She even adjusted the side mirror before sitting back down. That small act stayed with Rehan. It reminded him that the system wasn't broken everywhere. It had cracks, wide ones, but there were still people holding it up. People who did the job with patience, without being asked. They just never went viral. A few seats ahead, he noticed a young woman, early 20s, tired eyes flipping through a textbook. Her name tag read Amina. She looked up for a moment, her eyes meeting Rehan's. She stared, realizing who he was. "Sir," she said under her breath, leaning across the aisle. "I saw the video." Rehan smiled politely. "Let's not make a scene." Amina smiled nervously. "I just wanted to say thank you for showing them what it looks like to stay calm." He nodded. "Calm isn't weakness. It's knowing exactly when not to let someone take your peace. She lowered her eyes, thoughtful. I wish I had done something. I was on a different bus that day, but I've seen it happen before. We all have, Rayhan said softly. The question is what we do next time. Amina looked away, her thoughts clearly spiraling somewhere deep, somewhere personal. As the bus moved closer to the city center, Rayhan pulled out the file again. He opened it slowly, rereading Feroza's report. Every line still felt like a wound someone had tried to dress with silence. He told me I should know my place. He said it twice. I didn't speak. I got off early. I never reported it before because I thought no one would care. Rayhan closed the file gently, as if sealing it shut wasn't enough. As if it needed to be honored, not just reviewed. The bus slowed again. Another stop. An older gentleman boarded and paid cash. He nodded to the driver. She greeted him with a genuine smile. As he passed by Rayhan, he stopped, studying him. You're him, aren't you? Rayhan smiled lightly. Just another rider. No, the man said, voice quiet but sure. You're the man who reminded us that being quiet doesn't mean being small? Rayhan didn't respond, because he didn't need to. The man walked on, took his seat, and Rayhan looked forward once more. Not to the next news cycle, not to the next headline, but to the future of this route, this department, this city. He would rewrite policies, he would hold people accountable, he would correct every file labeled no action taken. But for now, he was just a passenger again, sitting in a public seat, watching public life, reminding everyone who noticed him that power doesn't need a stage. It just needs to show up, sit down, and refuse to stay silent. The bus neared its final stop, the same one it had pulled into just the morning before, when a different driver had tried to erase a man with nothing more than suspicion. But today, the ride ended not with conflict, but with something deeper, awareness. As the engine hissed and the brakes released a soft sigh, Rayhan stood. He picked up his old leather briefcase, worn at the corners, still holding the file that mattered more than his title. Passengers turned to look at him as he walked toward the front. Some of them didn't know his name. Others did. But they all knew what he had come to represent now. Not just authority, not just a face from the news, but proof that a person with power could still stand in line, sit in silence, and show up where it mattered. Parveen, the driver, turned slightly in her seat and looked up at him. She had figured it out halfway through the ride. Someone had whispered, someone else had shown her the video on their phone. But she hadn't changed how she treated him. She hadn't tried to impress him. She had just kept doing her job, fairly, respectfully, exactly how it should have always been. Rayhan gave her a small nod. You're doing good work. Parveen blinked, surprised at the compliment. Thank you, sir. He stepped off the bus and walked slowly down the steps to the sidewalk, greeted by the same familiar chaos of the city. Cars honking, morning crowds pushing toward crosswalks, vendors setting up on corners. He didn't walk fast. He didn't try to disappear. He let himself move through it like any other citizen. But behind him, something had changed. Passengers sat quietly for a few more moments after he left. Harris, from the day before, had boarded again and recognized him instantly. Amina was still there, still holding her textbook, but now her eyes followed Rayhan until he vanished into the crowd. Clara had taken another route, but she had already posted the full video online. No edits, just the raw truth. Across the city, conversations were unfolding. In bus depots, drivers were whispering, some defensive, some embarrassed. A few thankful that finally someone had exposed what they had never had the courage to say aloud. In offices, emails were being drafted. Legal teams reviewed footage. Public relations teams tried to find the right words to say something meaningful without admitting guilt. But most importantly, in homes and on sidewalks, people talked. Mothers explained to their children why the man in the video didn't yell. Fathers talked about dignity over pride. Young people who had once stayed silent in uncomfortable moments now asked themselves, what would I do if I saw it happen again? And in the transit department, a new culture was taking shape. Not because of a meeting or a memo or a rebranding campaign, but because one man got on a bus without needing to announce who he was, and left a room full of passengers knowing exactly what he stood for. Back in his office, Rayhan opened a new folder. This one had no name on it, no incident report, just a blank form, the start of a new policy. At the top, he wrote, "Every citizen shall be treated with dignity, without exception, without hesitation, and without needing to prove their worth." He paused, then continued, "No position, no title, no background gives anyone the right to decide who matters. Every driver, every officer, every employee in public service is here to serve, not to judge." He set down the pen and leaned back, eyes closed for a moment. The world outside continued its noise. Horns, engines. The rumble of the city never stopped. But in that small corner office, one man had turned a humiliating moment into a movement. Not by fighting, not by yelling, but by letting the system expose itself and choosing, with steady silence, to make sure it could never hide again. Justice had not come with handcuffs. It had come with truth, presence, and a decision to never leave dignity behind at the door of power. And though the ride was over, the real journey had just begun. If this story touched you, make sure to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories coming soon.